Hello, innovators. I'm Todd Wyatt, and welcome to the Bridging the Gap podcast presented by Greatech Group. You're invited to join our conversation to model the future of construction innovation and the digital transformation adventure of this a great industry. My guest today is Grant Geiger. He's a leader at the intersection of modular innovation, industrialized workflows, and real-world delivery. He's the CEO of EIR Healthcare, where he's driving the adoption and repeatability industrialized approaches to complex projects, particularly in sectors like healthcare, where speed, quality, and predictability are mission critical. Welcome to the show, Grant. Thanks for taking the time and joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Todd. Pleasure to be here.
I always like to get people's backstories to start the conversation. So how did you get into this industry to begin with?
Well, that's a good question. I feel like everyone probably has a good story. Mine, actually, I started in the healthcare industry coming up on 20 years ago. I actually started in marketing. So I started by marketing electronic medical records to clinicians and hospitals and health systems. So pretty far cry from where I am today. But when I started in the healthcare industry, that's what kind of got my interest and what's carried through, in all these years. I went on to install medical records. So I did EMR implementations. I had to work closely with clinicians and doctors with them, in their hospital, trying to get their medical records working. And then back during 08, 09, I was one of the subject matter experts for meaningful use, which was the federal legislation that passed around reimbursement for patient experience and patient outcomes. So I worked on that on the IT side. And so my career migrated into IT, ran a large data center for Siemens, got into sort of the operational side. And then within the last 10 years, got into the modular industry because of my own, both at this point, experience in healthcare, having worked in technology, but also seeing, the opportunity for change, seeing how much, we can do better in terms of the built environment. And so comes somewhat of a passion project for me, and working on some legacy of, how can we improve healthcare and make it a better place.
Yeah.
So.
Love that. I'm a marketing guy at heart too. That's my whole career background in construction. But yeah, so I love hearing that. Marketing for the win there for sure. What do you think about marketing? How did that kind of set the groundwork then for what you're doing now with offsite?
Yeah, that's also good. That's actually a really good one. I mean, the reality is I think we as an industry, and what I'm talking about is the prefabrication industry at this point. I think, marketing is something we could all do better with, right? Including ourselves. And I think part of it has been trying to understand what our message is. And, that's what we're talking about today on the podcast and, advancing prefabrication, other things like that. But, the reality is that people, I think, don't still fully understand or grasp, or maybe appreciates the right word, the opportunity that prefabrication has. In the rest of the world, it's been certainly more successful. You take a look at where modular and prefab has been in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere. It's a much higher percentage of construction. So I think, our work's cut out for us in the marketing section here. And I'm always, trying to educate and bring people into the fold. So,
yeah. It's interesting. So we've been doing this podcast for 6 years, and one of my soapboxes is that construction as a whole is terrible at marketing and telling their story themselves. I like to think it's gotten better, especially like in the last year, that people are getting a bit more comfortable kind of sharing it. But it's been a source of frustration for me of like, we have to tell our story and like own it. Like, it's a great story that we have here. It's super cool. There's a lot of tech coming in, a lot of innovation. We just leave it to other people to tell it, and they have no idea what's going on.
That's true. That's true. It's a good point.
I'd love for people to own it more. So let's dig into kind of the systematizing of prefab. So let's start kind of defining the terms. So what does that actually mean in practice beyond just kind of the standardizing components or modulars?
Yeah, so I think it can be, we don't have enough minutes in the podcast to cover everything, right? But I think going back to my original background and everything like that, I actually ended up, so where I sit today, I'm actually an industrial engineer. My focus is in systems engineering and specifically in healthcare systems. So, I actually felt after my career was I needed to go back and better understand it. And the reason why I start there is because, I think that we have the opportunity to actually drive a fundamental shift in the industry, and it's by understanding what we're trying to deliver in our case for healthcare. How are we actually trying to deliver healthcare in the future, right? How do
Mhm.
we want to solve that problem? And what I famously like to tell people, or maybe it's not famous, but what I like to tell people is that, the reality is I think physical healthcare infrastructure is like the last part of innovation in healthcare, right? You think about the healthcare industry, we've done so much to innovate around drug development and robotics, surgery, and like all these crazy
Mhm.
things that you hear about, but the physical space, we still have to go somewhere to receive care.
Mhm.
And the healthcare industry is unique in the sense that, unlike other verticals that we in construction talk about, like residential and multifamily and so forth, healthcare is probably one of the most standardized, right? So it's the one that is the most, I think, should be welcoming and adaptable to standardization.
Mhm.
And so when we talk about systems and how do we create systemizing, prefab, how do we actually make that happen? It's really a conversation with the health system and saying, what are your goals in terms of what you're trying to accomplish in terms of healthcare delivery? We're not at a conversation about price per square foot. We're not at a conversation about, your construction schedule. We're talking about as a system, let's say you operate 20 hospitals across 3 states. What's your delivery model, right? How do you handle outpatient care versus inpatient care? What are the needs in certain demographics, right? So healthcare is kind of a unique situation, but we think very strongly that it is the one out of many other verticals that has the most opportunity because of standardization. And so we kind of take that concept and drive it all the way down to the construction level,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I,
So
I love that. Why do you think that there's that disconnect then in the physical space innovation? Because you're right. I think of healthcare and all the like crazy tech that's come into it, and just
yeah,
a massive amounts of progress there. But uh,
yeah,
uh, until you said that, it was like the light bulb went off of like, oh yeah, the physical space for sure of healthcare needs to
yeah,
be just as innovative and keep up. And
yeah, yeah.
it's like this. I don't know. There's a disconnect there. Why do you think that
Uh,
it leads to that?
yeah, it's an interesting. I think there's a lot of factors at play. I think one of them is, look, the average age of the plant in healthcare infrastructure, so the building itself, usually today it's over 45 years old. And, we have clients that we're working with today in the United States that have facilities that were built in 1957 that they're still using for
Mhm.
inpatient care. And that's not like, if you're not in the healthcare facilities business, you probably think that sounds outrageous, but most healthcare facilities folks would probably tell you that's pretty normal. Like every health system's got that building that's 60 years old that they still
Right.
use. And I think it's just that, the reason is that, the incentives in healthcare, healthcare folks like to say that we operate in a world of perverse incentives. And so what that means from my perspective is like they're not incentivized to actually upgrade their infrastructure, right? Their reimbursement, how systems get paid and what they do with those funds has nothing to do with the physical plant, right? It actually
Mhm.
has to do with patient care. And so it's not until recently where we've had, for example, reimbursement tied to patient experience. Now, all of a sudden, we're in a situation where a patient may go into the hospital, they may come out and they may be treated, but they may have had a terrible time and they will report that or they will give an experience score, which affects the reimbursements of that hospital. So there hasn't been, as I said earlier, those kind of like incentives, I think, aligned to try to force that. And so the cost of construction and the development of construction has sort of been um, well, it hasn't been properly, I think, like organized into the day-to-day operations, from a strategy standpoint, right? They
Mhm.
don't think of it. If it takes them 3, 4, 5 years to open a new ambulatory facility, how do you think strategically about how do you do that if it takes you 5 years to get there? The
Right.
whole market can change before you even, before you get there.
And
So
probably will change.
it's been overlooked, I think to a certain extent.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes
So.
sense. So let's dig into that a bit more. Where do you typically see organizations struggle most with trying to move prefab from kind of these one-off successes to the more
Mm.
repeatable delivery models?
So I actually think the health systems and hospitals that are operating in a world where they have a strategic plan and they're going about things with using traditional construction, um, they may have the hardest time. I think the other group are folks that are sort of scrappier, maybe competitive health systems or operators, but they haven't had a strategic process in place, and so they're now jumping into modular or prefab for the first time,
Mhm.
and they have a different set of challenges. But I think ultimately for both of them, it's really about a mindset shift to say, if you're going to take a systematic approach, if you're operating a health system, which you are, and you're covering a demographic area, how do I use a repeatable industrialized process to achieve scale? Right. And so, like, to give you a concrete example of what I'm actually talking about, you know, the clients that we're working with, particularly in California right now, they've developed with us a system where they essentially designed one clinic. That one clinic is 6,000 square feet, but it is adaptable based on the acuity and the clinical needs of where they're going to deliver the care. So
Mm.
obviously there's site conditions, right? Things may change from one location to the other. But with, let's say, a 5 or 6,000 square foot footprint, you have a building that you can design that is deployable across your demographic. And maybe your first clinic needs to be, and I'm hypothetically speaking here, but perhaps the first clinic needs to be pediatrics. The second one maybe is for behavioral health. um, Maybe you have one that's focused on orthopedic care, but the point is the physical infrastructure actually stays the same, and then you can adjust inside based on the clinical need. And so, this is like a really small example. It's only 6,000 square feet, 6,000. But the point is that I can then, from a prefab standpoint, work with a manufacturer to run these clinics off the factory floor. They come out every 12 weeks. And all of a sudden, they're now in a position where they're talking about making a step form improvement, like a multi-step improvement into going from having, let's say, no clinics in this geographical area to having three in less than a
Mhm.
year, right? Because they've taken this systematic approach of saying standardization. All these buildings have the same look and feel. They all use the same casework. They all use it, but that doesn't mean that they're not high end, right? So it's still a high quality product, but it's just repetitive.
Right.
So,
I think it's a great example because one of the myths around prefab is that it is cookie cutter, and so you can't have that. You can't balance that flexibility, and so it's a
right.
great example of, like, yes, you can. You can have
Yeah.
flexibility for real world situations while also having that standardization approach.
Yep. Yeah.
So, how early in the project lifecycle should the prefab strategy really, be defined to avoid all the downstream rework and,
Yeah.
and inefficiencies that might pop up?
We get asked this question every time, and every time I think I just keep moving further and further left and further up the stream. I mean, and it's true though. The reality is it is almost the first principles concept. It has to be from the beginning.
Hmm.
And I mean that sincerely because I've been on every end of that spectrum. I've been at the other end, which is, and many people, listeners probably have, if you have experience with modular, have been there. The other end, which is, hey, here's my approved traditional plans. Can you modularize those for me? Right. That's the
Yeah.
other end of the spectrum, which we don't want to be at. But no, I mean, I think where we are most successful and where our clients are most successful is when you start at the very beginning. And again, it's a mindset saying, this is the approach we're going to take as part of a strategy. And the reality is, if you think about it, right, you're not, as a developer or a builder or an operator, your goal is not to go out there and do this once. That's not probably successful,
Hmm.
right? So, or the reality is you need to sit there and really think about, well, yeah, I'm building this one clinic, it's a big project, or I'm building this one hospital or this whatever it may be. But what if I built two? What if I built three? What would I want to do? Yeah, it's just you have to ask those questions ahead of time, and you can never start early enough. So we're usually there even sometimes before architects or GCs or anybody else are hired.
Yeah, nice.
So.
Do you see more awareness and momentum being built for bringing it earlier in the process?
I think so. I think so. As more people go through the process and they
Hmm.
really see what it's like, they understand and appreciate the idea of moving forward and but making that decision early on. Because if the further you go down that slide,
Hmm.
the more complicated it is to mix in with all the traditional trades, which you still need, right? This isn't
Right.
a fully, what people forget is that when you go prefab, this isn't 100% of the project that's offsite. It's maybe 80% if you're lucky, but you still got to do a whole bunch of work on site. There's still a totally different process from this,
Hmm.
which is traditional construction that has to occur, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, for
yeah,
sure. So one of the things that enables that shift left is really the digital tools that are coming up. How do you see
sure.
the digital tools shifting from supporting prefab to actually enabling and scaling it across the projects?
Yeah, honestly, and maybe I'm an outlier in this, but I think we got a long way to go. I think we have some really great tools out there. I think what we've done in BIM as a tool, as a standalone tool is phenomenal. But when you get out there and you live in the real world, the reality is that these tools do not carry through in the life cycle of the project.
Mm,
And so I think in an ideal world, or where we want to go as an organization and what we do in the industry, is we want these digital tools to be also repetitive, right? And so what I mean by that is, if we're going to invest in and actually build the BIM model, and we're going to have a truly layered 3D model, which is architectural, MEP, and structural, everything's in there. Um, Today, we don't see a lot of parts of the design team or organization standing up to own it. And the reality is the client themselves are probably, in some cases, they're not actually set up to own it either because they don't have the in-house expertise. And so I think, it's interesting for us when we work with a manufacturer, we are expecting them to help deliver a digital twin or a 3D model as part of their shop drawing process as they go out, to construction and start working on the floor. But you still have then the architect who had already started, with their plan somewhere along the way. That has to get merged in.
mhm,
You have to layer in MEP. You have to layer in all this other stuff. Um, and you have your clash detection, all the stuff you got to do. And then you build the building. And the question is, what happens to the digital twin, right? Who's going to own it? Who's going to manage it? And so I think that's, it's kind of like, we talk about this in some of our presentations, but it's like, you have to have this systems, again, systems sort of like infrastructure layer to manage this. It's kind of like in software development when you need like DevOps, you need someone else, a third party that's out there that's actually help managing it because the factory, once they're done, they just hand the model off and they don't care anymore. The architect, they're done, they hand it off, right?
mhm.
And so there's, I think the tools are great, but we got to figure out better ways to make them live in the whole life cycle.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
I mean, I think one of the big questions that is in front of construction on the technology front is how do you connect all the workflows and the datas to bring down the
sure.
silos that exist between every single stakeholder there,
Yep.
and that brings up maybe the question of who owns the data, and there might be a, a battle for that, but being able to connect the different
Yeah.
technologies together in that kind of interoperability state is going to be massive, and
Yeah.
there's glimpses of that, but there's still
Yeah.
some big pieces of that puzzle that needs to click in.
Well, I think we can, it's a good comment. I think we can look at other industries to figure out how this works. And particularly, I actually look at the healthcare industry in this case. I think about PHI and public personal health information. It's very similar, right? A
Mhm,
highly monetized data set, extremely valuable to stakeholders, in that case, clinicians, physicians, and so forth. But in the healthcare world, it's the patient that actually owns the data. Right now, they don't actually necessarily control it in a sense because it moves from your digital medical record from one hospital to another, from your provider and so forth.
mhm.
But it's similar in a sense in terms of like the data. And I would argue in that case, the client, right, should be owning the data. But the problem is, again, they're not properly probably set up to do it. That's kind of the issue.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. So you brought up BIM as well too. Where does BIM kind of deliver the most value in a prefab workflow? And kind of the flip side of that coin, where are people underutilizing BIM right now?
Hmm. It's a good question. Also good questions. I think, you know, uh for us, I think the opportunity where we get the most value for BIM is when we are finally doing something repetitive. So when
Mhm.
we're saying, okay, we have, we call them internally modules of use. So we have standardized modules that we know we can use and carry over for a client onto different projects. And so when you have that sort of um, data set that's already pre-built in BIM, it's configured the way you want it, you know it's going to work. And for us, like our standardization is really more or less around dimensions, due to transportation and logistics and other things, as opposed to we're not always going to say that a plumbing fixture is always going to be in the southeast corner, right? It's not like,
Mhm.
so it's a little bit, we have a slightly maybe different approach than some others because we're not a trade, we're more of a integrator. But I think for us, when we're able to say, here's something that we've been developing for a client and now it's evolved and permutations have occurred into different types of clinics but we've built off of this data set, that's where it's been really helpful. I don't think it's been, I still think we have problems with, to your comment earlier, where we need the most help is I think in owning the data and the integration with the parties, the third
Mhm.
parties, because we still feel like, we'll have something with a casework manufacturer, for example, and they'll find stuff after the architect and the manufacturer should have picked up on some of the integrations. But all of a sudden a casework guy will come along and say, well, we put in our libraries into the model. Here's all of our casework, and your sinks are, 6 inches too high or too low. And I'm like, well, why is that guy catching it? Why
Right.
wasn't it someone else, like the architect or the MEP guy, or. So I feel like there isn't still like that. I don't think it's a referee, but we need someone that's like better at quarterbacking all of those types of, to your point, I think those integrations and connections.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's funny, when I agree. When you say that though, like I'm going back to the kind of the original promise of BIM was you would see all those class detections and it'd be super easy to spot that and anybody could find that. And now it's like you need another layer to be able to specifically look for that as well too. And
Yep.
as technology makes things easier, it also adds another layer of
Yeah.
you know
Well,
operations.
and it also is due to the skill level, right? Like we
Sure.
still have some architects that give us their sheets in PDFs and they might give us a CAD file, but then that's about as far as they go, right?
Hmm.
And so, that's also the funny thing I think for us is, there used to be the concept of in traditional construction, you have your SDDD CD, you have your CD set, you have your permit set that's approved. You had all these different sets, right, that you would work through as you get to construction. The reality is I think the level, like, you call it L100 all the way down, like the level of detail from a traditional construction is only maybe 95% of what you can get to digitally, and then you see the factory might push that to 96, 97, 98%. But I still don't feel like I'm ever really in a world where I have a true, fully 100% digital model because it's just it's impossible to get everybody to contribute and then sort of air traffic control that whole integration,
Hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So we made it pretty far in before I brought this topic up, which this may be a record recently for me, but I have to bring up AI. So AI and automation, they're for sure part of this evolution in this journey when we talk about digital tools as well.
Yeah.
Where do you see the most practical applications today? Not necessarily the hype, but where real impact is happening.
Mm. I was at an event in New York City a couple of weeks ago, and it was with a VC and a couple a dinner, and they had all the founders stand up, introduce themselves. Sorry, I'm telling you a little anecdotal story here. And they all stood up and everyone said, we're using AI to do this. Every single founder, right?
Hmm.
And so to your point, I think a lot of it is somewhat overblown, right? The counter or sort of old age wisdom is also that, we used to do stuff back in the day called business analytics and data mining and cloud computing. These were all what AI still says that does today,
Right.
right? So yeah, I don't think in one hand we haven't evolved that much. It's just us kind of talking about something in a new way. I think the most interesting or at least compelling, and this ties back to systemizing, is the ability to feed a larger model of sort of, an ecosystem of not just plans and drawings, but also other data insights. So again, we live in healthcare. So for us, it's always healthcare, but thinking about clinical workflows, thinking about staffing ratios, reimbursement. But I think AI could be really helpful for us in trying to combine discrete sets of data that we don't necessarily have insight on today. And there I'll give you kind of a good story on this. So like over COVID, there's a book I read called I think it's called like The Discrete Life, or like it has a weird, kind of a funky start, but I'll go with The Discrete Life of Hospital Architecture. And I'll get the name for you and I'll send it afterwards. But um, what they talked about was in this in this book, it's two professors of architecture. They talked about the correlation and the location of a patient room to a nurse station. And
Mhm.
there's a 40% change in morbidity for a patient based on where they were in relationship to that nurse station, which is
Wow.
nuts to think
Yeah.
about, right? And so
Massive.
like that's what I'm talking about, right? So that kind of data, how do we actually put that kind of information into a model and allow us to actually truly come up with something ideal? I had the head of facilities for a large health system here in the PA region a couple years ago reach out to me and he said, Grant, I don't understand. We have a standardized patient room, but every time we start a project, we start with a blank sheet of paper. But we already know what our room looks like. Why are we doing that? And so, like, that's the kind of stuff that I think that's like a very practical thing, but I think
Uh-huh.
it's something that AI can help us. And, what I say is I think we can kind of bend the design curve and bend it in a way that benefits everybody, but it's really bending it so we aren't just recreating the wheel every single time. We're actually using inference and trying to come up with something a little bit better.
Mhm.
So I think that's where AI could be. Um, but to your point, maybe I cheated a little bit. It's not that doesn't exist today. So
Well, I
smart
think it's
concern.
a great promise of
Yeah,
AI.
yeah,
I
yeah,
do giggle when people are saying, "Oh, I'm doing AI for this." I'm like, well, actually, that's just like a basic API, or like
yeah,
we were already
yeah,
doing that. It's just
yeah,
an automation
yeah,
built in.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
cool. It's not
Yeah,
necessarily
no,
AI.
yeah, exactly,
So
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think it's great.
yeah.
So kind of looking ahead, what kind of digital advancements? Maybe it was just what you were saying there, but what digital advancements do you think will have the biggest impact on prefab? In the next kind of 3 years.
Actually, I can give you one that I think is a little bit better. I think, and a little bit more sort of like down to earth. Personally, I think the biggest opportunity for all of us in the industry is to leverage modular construction as a moat for us to integrate more technology into the product, right?
Mm.
So I think over the next 3 to 5 years, what I tell people is if you ever go to a conference for IoT sensors or other types of technology, the solutions already exist.
Mhm.
We just have to find a way to actually plug them into the modules or to the prefab that we're working on, and actually enable these buildings. I think that a lot of cases, some of these technologies kind of get left to the wayside because because the people making these decisions from a traditional construction standpoint, they look at them and say, well, they're nice to have, but I don't need to have them. I can't fit them out until I get the building up. It costs too much money, whatever the excuse is. And so I think the best thing we can do as an industry, and we do this every day, but it's like, how do I jam these modules with as much technology, sensors, monitoring, volatile organic compounds, looking at airflow quality, all these things.
Mhm.
How do I find ways to do that and actually make it as smart as possible? And it's kind of like, to use the example I'll use automotive with Tesla. We're all making cars, right? Whether it's prefab or not, we're all making buildings. It's the exact same thing. The question is, how do we make ours smarter? How do we make it more capable? And I think that's
Mhm.
something that we can do today because the technology is already there.
Yeah.
So,
Love it. So we're about a month away from the Advancing Prefabrication Conference, the big 10th anniversary of it. You're
yeah.
going to be speaking of it. What gets you excited about advancing prefab? Why attend?
I mean, honestly, for me, it's the people. It's interesting to be able to see what I what for me consider like people that I don't have in my day-to-day life, because my vertical is obviously just healthcare, but to be able to see the breadth across prefabrication.
Mm.
And then also, just I think it's pretty global, pretty international too. So it's not focused on just what's in the US. So I think that's a nice view. And I like to hear what other people are doing, because something that may be going on in residential or in the factory, you never know. I might be able to bring that to what I do. So it's always good for us.
Yeah.
So,
I love it. Yeah, I've been going the last several years, and it's always fun to hear the ideas and the information sharing that goes on. I think that's pretty
for,
unique.
yep.
It happens at conferences, but advancing prefab people are very willing to be like, yeah, this is the good, the bad, the ugly. Here's where we
Yeah.
struggled with. Here's what
Yeah.
went well. Share anything that you want, and which is really cool.
Yeah.
That's it's an
Yeah,
interesting
for
space.
sure. For sure. We spoke 5 years ago when we launched the first modular patient room, and now we're back again. So we're excited. Yeah.
Nice. Oh, as
Yeah.
we kind of wrap up here, a couple rapid fire questions for you. The first, what does the phrase modeling the future, what does that kind of mean and look like to you?
Oh man. Modeling the future. I think I think that means it's a algorithm, you know.
Yeah,
Trying to come up with some sort of algorithm, right? I don't know.
nice.
I
For
didn't
the
want to
AI
say AI.
to win
I didn't want to
our
say
AI
yeah.
overlords.
Yeah, I was
Like
trying. I didn't want to use the word
Terminator
AI.
style.
So
Okay.
yeah.
What does innovation mean to you?
The physical space, easily. It's where I think, as I said earlier, the biggest opportunity.
Yeah. Nice. How do
Yeah.
people find out more information and connect with you?
Yeah, easy. Go to www.eirhealthcare.com. So,
Awesome. And last question for you. If I could give you all construction power, you could snap your fingers and innovate one thing. What would you pick to innovate?
I would work on simplifying approvals and code structures for buildings in the United States.
You figure that out, and you'll be
Hey, you said snap the
a
fingers,
very
so.
rich, famous man. It's a good
There
one.
you go.
Well,
Yeah.
Grant, thanks so much for taking the time and joining the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Have a good one. Appreciate it.
Awesome. And now it's time for my Todd takes from this episode. First take: prefab only scales when you stop treating it like a project. Prefab falls short when it's approached as a one-off solution instead of an operating model. The real breakthroughs happen when organizations step back and think in terms of delivery strategy, repeatability, and long term systems. When prefab becomes infrastructure rather than an experiment, speed, predictability, and quality flow. Second take: standardization doesn't kill flexibility, it enables it. There's a persistent myth that standardization leads to cookie cutter outcomes. In reality, a strong standardized foundation creates more flexibility, not less. When the core system is consistent, teams can adapt interiors, workflows, and use cases to real world needs without reinventing the wheel every time. And finally, digital tools matter, but ownership matters more. Construction has no shortage of powerful digital tools. The real gap is ownership and continuity of data across the lifecycle. Without clear responsibility for the digital thread from design through manufacturing and operations, handoffs break down and value gets lost. Technology enables scale, but systems thinking makes it sustainable. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you are interested in learning more, you can visit our sponsor, Great Tech Group, at greattech.com. For more information, you can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, be sure to check out our website, bridgingthegappod.com. As always, I'm Todd Wyant, thanking you for joining the conversation to model the future on the Bridging the Gap podcast. Keep innovating.